the United States empire.
Murders, crime.
It's chaotic. It is a mess.
After a 100-year rise up.
We have this international crisis.
If this system continues without reform, I think there is a very real possibility of violence and potentially a split in the United States.
The US empire is collapsing, and the world is already paying the price. Trillions of dollars wasted on endless wars with shifting goalposts and no exit strategy. Add to this a crumbling economic foundation and a desperate scramble to maintain global dominance, and what you have are all the familiar signs of imperial decline. Spain spent its silver on military campaigns it couldn't afford. Britain exhausted itself trying to hold on to its expansive empire. And now, the US is burning through resources apparently trying to speedrun the apocalypse. Empires end suddenly, but collapse slowly. The US is no different. It isn't just losing its grip on global power, it's setting the stage to allow chaos to flourish. The only question now is, how long will the world suffer for the US's sins? Before we dive in, we'd like to take a quick moment to thank our channel sponsor, Aura. And actually, it's a really important time to talk about them because hackers may have just stolen the social security numbers of every American. Over 2.9 billion records were recently stolen from national public data, which provides personal information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others doing background checks. These stolen records include a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number and phone number, alternate names, and birth date. And members of the hacker group have released this information for free online. If you've never been the victim of a data breach before, let me tell you, it's not fun. That stuff is scary, as well as being very intrusive. If you weren't taking precautions with your personal information online before, this should be a huge wake-up call. You've never been more vulnerable online than you are right now. Thankfully, I don't have to worry about it because Aura protects me from this exact scenario. Aura alerts me if they find my phone number, email, or social security number on the dark web. They let me know immediately if anyone tries to use this information to access my credit or bank accounts. And for added peace of mind, they provide up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen. They also have a bunch of other features to keep you safe, all inside one app, so you don't have to go looking for a bunch of different services for your VPN, your antivirus, and your data security. You can use the link aura.com/firstthought to try 14 days absolutely free. That's plenty of time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data has been exposed. I highly recommend you do this right now, because not only is national public data not going to do anything to help us, they probably aren't even going to face any repercussions for this leak. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches. And if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/firstthought to try Aura for 2 weeks absolutely free. Okay, back to the video. Many empires throughout history have come and gone, but two in particular stand out as being eerily similar to today. The Spanish Empire of the 16th and 17th centuries, and the British Empire of the 18th and 19th which replaced it, the Napoleonic era aside. Then the US Empire replaced the British. So let's take a look at what lessons the US should learn from these former global powers. The Spanish Empire was mostly split between Europe and the Americas, which quickly pulled it into wars it could not afford. By 1619, the king's chief minister warned that overlapping conflicts had brought Spain to the brink. The king concocted a Union of Arms scheme, which aimed to mobilize 140,000 troops, an outrageous number for the time, across far-flung territories. Instead, the decree ignited local resistance due to the large burden it placed on townspeople and nobles alike. In 1627, the crown declared bankruptcy, obliterating credit and forcing steep interest loans. The following year, the Dutch seized an entire treasure fleet loaded with American gold and silver, which drastically slashed revenues and stalled military operations, followed by weaker silver shipments which further stalled military operations, and repeating on in a spiral of diminishing returns. And what did Spain have to show for this expensive, unending warfare? A lot of lost territory. They lost northern Catalonia, Portugal, Jamaica, and even parts of the Netherlands. Overwhelming debt, a hollowed-out domestic economy, and an unshakable faith in the idea that war was their best defense defined the Habsburg abysmal finances, with grandiose strategies that yielded nothing but loss. Philip IV spent 44 years mired in entirely optional conflicts against the Dutch, Germans, Italians, French, the British twice, and on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain's home turf. While Spain tried to retain its colonies, extreme climate events and earthquakes devastated Chile, Peru, and Mexico, only adding to the strain caused by the wars. The king's management of Spain's coinage was incompetent at best. Vellon coins, introduced in 1618, were silver coins that contained less valuable metals like copper, which debased the currency, adding to the inflation caused by a surge in silver imports from the colonies, which severely disrupted local markets and shrunk the crown's income. And even though silver shipments got leaner over time, silver still surged into Spain relative to historic levels of silver inflow, which started the inflation. Silver became a sort of resource curse that stymied real growth. While Spain's GDP had once greatly outpaced other regions, it had fallen 40% behind those same regions by 1750. Though American gold and silver financed imperial wars, they bred illusions of prosperity that sapped the homeland's economic core. Earlier monarchs had brought the nobility to heel, but by the 16th century, the crown was drowning in high-interest debt. Spain's fragmented and inadequate taxes, coupled with entrenched conservative nobles, stifled modernization. Chronic debt defaults eroded trust, while elites opposed any new taxes or reforms in order to protect their exemptions and status. These dynamics echo modern imperial overreach. A ballooning defense budget diverts funds away from essential investments like healthcare and infrastructure, leading to long-term instability. Now we'll move on to the British Empire, which, save for the whole Napoleon thing, was the empire to succeed Spain in Europe and possibly the first global hegemon. Despite losing the American colonies in the late 18th century, the British Empire would nonetheless grow and kickstart the first industrial revolution. But by the 1870s, global capitalism had begun to face a crisis. In 1889, a US analyst noted severe economic distress touching almost every nation on Earth, regardless of policies. Some might assume this would be a recipe for a major drop in production, but they'd be wrong. Production absolutely soared. Iron doubled, steel rose 20-fold, but profits lagged, as tends to happen during capitalist overproduction. Before the stock market crash of 1929 took the moniker, the period between 1873 and 1896 was called the Great Depression, and it's easy to see why. Agriculture took the biggest hit. Wheat prices plunged nearly 2/3 from 1867 to 1894, which prompted Britain to abandon much of its grain farming. During this 23-year depression, the pound experienced significant deflation, which cut British prices by 40%, further eating into profit margins. New industrial processes rapidly produced far more in less time, quickly outstripping demand, which increased pressure on already falling prices. New protective tariffs sprung up across Europe and the US, leaving Britain's free trade stance vulnerable. Heavy industries began to form monopolies and oligopolies, in part to protect their profits, and chain retailers displaced small shopkeepers. With the glut in manufacturing at home, capital needed new markets. And since this is the 19th century, new markets is code for colonies. However, colonies are a short-term solution to a fundamental problem with the system in which they operate. And the fact is that thanks to the exploitative nature of the relationship, colonies eventually rebel. Cue the Second Boer War, fought between 1899 and 1902 in areas that now make up South Africa, and could be considered Britain's Afghanistan. High Commissioner Alfred Milner saw peace under defeat as a sign of Britain's declining imperial clout, and it's hard to disagree with that assessment. The problems experienced in South Africa were a sign that Britain was struggling to maintain control over the empire on which the sun never set. The war cost the British taxpayer over £200 million. That's £21.8 billion in 2024 terms, making it Britain's most expensive conflict since 1815, and which wouldn't be surpassed until World War I. By 1940, Britain's hold on its most prized colony, India, was crumbling. Of course, some cabinet members tried to hang on, but the situation forced them to issue a withdrawal announcement in February of 1947. Lord Mountbatten accelerated the partition timeline, discarding interim agreements and ensuring independence by August, and relinquished authority even before revealing final boundaries. Both British elites and Indian nationalists saw their carefully laid plans dismantled by wartime exhaustion and near-constant domestic unrest. By 1948, Britain had granted independence to most of Asia, except Hong Kong, which it wouldn't give up until 1997, while the US grew to become the dominant Western power. By 1957, American influence had replaced Britain's over regions in which it once reigned supreme. Any remaining notion of British world leadership quickly waned, prompting faster decolonization to maintain Western cohesion. In both these cases, Spanish and British, spiraling military commitments and failing fiscal policies paved the way for new global powers, like the United States, to rise. Taking these previous empires' history as a rough guide to determining if the American empire is falling, let's see how many boxes the US ticks. In January of 2025, a massive sell-off of tech stocks erased around $1 trillion in capitalization at the opening bell, all because China released an app for free. It's difficult to overstate the historic nature of this crash. Apple alone lost $224 billion, Amazon shed $109 billion, and Nvidia briefly gave up over $300 billion before recovering about half that loss. By the close, Apple was down 4.8% and Amazon 4.1%. That's $162 billion and $72 billion respectively. Japan's Nikkei 225 plunged 12%, its worst day since 1987, and Bitcoin dropped 11%. Nvidia, once valued over $3 trillion after 3 consecutive quarters of over 200% revenue growth, fell to a measly $2.5 trillion. Goldman Sachs had warned that returns on AI spending would be minimal, and this is coming from one of the chief architects of the 2008 collapse. So if they are warning that something is a bad investment, it's probably best to listen, especially when major hedge funds called Nvidia's valuation part of an overhyped bubble. And they were right. The world watched a free app pop that bubble. We can't yet say what long-term effects this historic day will have. After all, we're still living through the shockwave. But the ghosts of empires past provide the US the knowledge to avoid similar pitfalls. Unfortunately, their pleas are falling on deaf ears. This crisis is, of course, a product of the specific material conditions we find ourselves in. But similar economic crises beset Britain in, for example, the First Great Depression. That historic deep-seek day is representative of the high wealth concentration in the US, and is representative of the wealth distribution among the people, too. Current data shows the top 0.1% alone own 13.8% of total US wealth, with the rest of the top 1% adding 16.9% for a total of 30.7% of all wealth, while the bottom 50% are left to split a meager 2.4%. Government spending patterns reflect this imbalance. The 2024 National Defense Authorization Act dedicated $886 billion to the military, $28 billion more than the previous year, partly for Ukraine, surpassing the budgets of the next 10 countries combined, with at least half the country perplexed as to why the budget is so outrageously high. From 2000 to 2010, the Pentagon canceled the Future Combat Systems, the Comanche helicopter, and the Crusader artillery gun after already wasting $46 billion taxpayer dollars, which, as it happens, exceeds the total Environmental Protection Agency budget between 2015 and 2020. Yet resources still flow to Bradley tank prototypes, almost $23 billion so far, and ballistic missile defense, over $67 billion since the late 1990s. The F-35 program, at $1.7 trillion across its lifespan, has endured repeated groundings and crashes, and yet remains set to expand by 2,400 more jets in the near future. Inflation has been brutal in the last few years, which has added to the economic hardship. And the best news so far is that it dipped to 3% year over year in mid-2023, which is of little consolation to the 61% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. The eggs are still expensive. Nearly 3/4 of those earning under $50,000, and 65% making $50,000 to $100,000. In other words, most Americans struggle with day-to-day expenses. Even 45% of those making over $100,000 also report living paycheck to paycheck. If it was most before, it's almost certainly a supermajority now. What's more, over half of adults say they are more financially stressed now than before the pandemic, relying on high-interest credit or limited savings to meet basic needs, which is absolutely unsustainable. And finally, despite having the supposedly most pro-union president in US history in Joe Biden, a dubious claim at best, union membership in 2023 stood at 10%, only 14.4 million workers, down from 10.1% in 2022. Despite the media calling it the year of the strike. This is, however, merely the tail end of a long-term, slow decline. In 2003, 15.8 million workers were union members, or about 11.5% of the workforce, far below the 28.3% peak in 1954, and only slightly more than today. Businesses spent $4.27 billion on federal lobbying in 2023 alone, and at time of writing, the calculations for 2024 haven't been completed, but are expected to be similar. But that's $4.27 billion they could have been using to provide their workers higher pay and better benefits. But that, according to them, doesn't have as good an ROI as lobbying. On that note, we'll turn to US imperial overreach, which has seen a steadily worsening decline in effectiveness in accomplishing individual missions, let alone broader goals. It shouldn't be surprising by now to learn that, at time of writing, the US has spent over $8 trillion on post-9/11 wars, aka the War on Terror, and yet its actual global position is weakening by the day. Afghanistan ended in a humiliating, unorganized, and inhumane withdrawal. Iraq remains unstable, and the supposed strategic gains of both unnecessary military quagmires never materialized, and never will. Like Spain before it, the US is bleeding resources on endless conflicts that gain little, or even return losses. The economic foundation of US hegemony, the dollar's dominance, is eroding. The share of global reserves held in dollars has declined steadily as more countries move to alternative currencies and systems. The US share of global GDP and trade has shrunk, further weakening the dollar in international finance. Non-traditional reserve holdings have grown from $30 billion in 1999 to $1.2 trillion in 2021, which is indicative of a calculated strategy to shift away from dollar reliance, which has accelerated in step with the US's ever more erratic and unpredictable policies and actions. Right now, China holds the largest stock of these alternative reserves, followed by Switzerland and Russia. The foreign exchange market itself has changed in the sense that currencies that once required conversion through the dollar are now traded directly. The petrodollar system, established after the US finalized its abandonment of the gold standard in 1971, has artificially propped up global demand for the dollar for decades. Today, oil producers, like Saudi Arabia, are negotiating with other nations to do business in currencies other than the dollar. For example, China has signed energy deals with Gulf states using China's yuan, accelerating the transition away from the dollar. BRICS is the largest organized effort leading the charge in challenging this system. The economic bloc created the New Development Bank as a counterweight to the US-controlled World Bank used in conjunction with the IMF to project US economic power. South African officials have explicitly linked these efforts to bypassing US financial dominance and resisting its frequent and illegal unilateral sanctions. Sanctions are Washington's main tool for enforcing dollar supremacy, and the practice is quickly losing its effectiveness. Russia has, in recent years, especially due to its war on Ukraine, been the subject of US sanctions. And yet, despite these sweeping Western restrictions, some of which targeted Russian energy exports and technology, their economy remains relatively stable. Western states, mostly in Europe, still rely on Russian energy. Belgium, France, and Spain continue purchasing large quantities of Russian liquefied natural gas. Even the US hesitates to cut off Russian oil completely, fearing market disruptions and price spikes that would benefit their geopolitical rival. Russia's economy grew 3.6% in 2023, after a contraction the previous year. Military production drove 60 to 65% of industrial output growth, but even sectors hit hardest by sanctions, manufacturing and retail, have rebounded. Russia's unemployment rate fell to 3.2% in 2023, the lowest since 1992. Projections for 2024 show continued growth, despite every Western attempt to isolate Russia economically. The sanctions have pushed Russia to strengthen ties with BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, deepening the global shift away from US economic control. They also forced Russia to replace Western imports with domestic production, strengthening key industries like shipbuilding and heavy machinery. Financial restrictions failed as well. After being cut off from SWIFT, Russia expanded its own payment networks and increased ruble-based trade. Moscow's alternative to SWIFT, the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, or SPFS, has gained new members, further undermining US financial influence. By early 2024, ruble transactions accounted for 43.9% of Russian export revenue, a sign of just how little the sanctions have achieved. The US assumed sanctions would bring Russia to its knees. Instead, they exposed the limits of American power. The dollar is losing ground, and the US no longer controls the global economy. The United States is repeating the failures of past empires. Spain drained its wealth fighting unwinnable wars, collapsing under debt and economic stagnation. Britain, too, overstretched itself, clinging to imperial dominance as industrial rivals surpassed it. The US is following the same pattern. $8 trillion wasted on post-9/11 wars, no clear strategic gains, and rising instability at home and abroad. The dollar's dominance is fading. BRICS nations are bypassing US financial control, and sanctions have failed to cripple Russia. Washington's ability to dictate global trade is fading fast. At home, record defense spending grows year after year, while corporations suppress wages and watch silently as inequality surges towards catastrophic levels. Empires don't collapse overnight. They bleed out slowly, often lashing out as the end nears in a vain attempt to recapture past glory. But there will be no glory to be found for the US. The immense power it still wields is held atop crumbling foundations. Without radical change, it will follow Spain and Britain into the history books as yet another empire with the hubris to think they can outrun the consequences.